How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to another CCH podcast. I think that we've had a really productive spring season, whether it was talking with Alex Basato about the birding migration or even the hiking show for all seasons. We had Ben and Josh on. We had a chance to speak to them and hear what's going on at the halfway point. What do we have to look forward to for the upcoming episodes for the hiking show? And we might even get into a little bit of that discussion here with our other guest. And we have our other guest, Dempsey. So I'm really excited for this episode. It's been a long time coming. I try to evaluate who I think would be the most interesting and informative person to get on the podcast for you guys to hear just different perspectives, whether it's hiking or it's conservation or different critters or even drones. So Dempsey is going to bring us into a new avenue for the discussion tonight. Where we've been talking about birding, we've talked about drones, we've talked about ants. So this is another good discussion tonight. We're going to focus on a little bit of his work with Trout Unlimited. He's also involved in a lot of education and different aspects with Carnegie. He's a good friend and also very serious conservationist and environmentalist. So Dempsey, please introduce yourself to people.
Thank you for that intro. I don't think I can do better than that. But hi, my name's Dempsey. I'm a museum educator one at Carnegie Museum of Natural History. I'm also an environmental educator at Powder Mill Nature Reserve, where Aaron and I first met. I work with Trout Unlimited on the Ligonier, PA side, the Forbes Trail section. Mostly for group meetings, tines, stream restorations. But yeah, I also love to hike, bike, and all things birding too. So looking forward to the chat here and tying in riparian zones kind of into Pennsylvania's ecology when discussing this. So
Yeah, and we kind of mentioned briefly in a previous podcast about shed hunting and ramp hunting, and like it's been briefly talked about off and on the podcast about fishing. So I know that's a really important topic that we're going to get into because that's another aspect of what the wildlife has to offer for us and all the different recreational opportunities in Pennsylvania. But if you want to just kind of get in a little bit to maybe what you're working on, I know you were doing some really cool, was it inspecting mines?
yeah, so I work on the side for a company in Carnegie, PA called RPG, and they are a fracking well pad site and coal minage drainage site for water line inspection and for drainage inspection into like rivers and streams. So right now, what we're doing is at the federal level, it's a tri-state combination of West Virginia, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, mostly the Ohio River Valley. And it's about reducing the amount of gallons of both brine, fracking fluids, and mine drainage from mines that have previously been accessed through pillar and room mining. Right now, they are expanding, and as we get into this new year, we're going to see more developments in fracking pads and well sites, regardless of your opinion on them in Washington, Pennsylvania, and downwards into the Triadelphia, West Virginia area. So,
Yeah, I was aware that we had a lot of different spots in like Washington and parts of Greene counties. So that's primarily where we're going to see a little bit more start popping up.
and in terms of affecting warm water fisheries, I mean, no matter what, brine waters and fracking fluids are going to cause some level of pollutants. Now, in Pennsylvania, we have a mix of cold water and warm water fisheries, and that's going to affect the cold water fisheries a lot more because of sensitivity. Bass, smallmouth, bluegill, and the 14 variations we have in the state here can handle. They're a little more tolerant of pollution than your traditional trout or traditional brook trout, which is our state fish. So that's part of the balance here in Pennsylvania with mining and extractions. Again, whether politics are at play or not, that is something that we use as a general way to power our homes and vehicles and etc. So that will definitely continue, at least for the next foreseeable future. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
So the company that you work with, do they go out and inspect it to make sure that these different companies are like following regulations, or like where's your the company that you work for at in that whole aspect?
The industry itself is a mix of environmental enforcement and action, and in a sense, there's a balancing act with these companies where you are contracted through the companies to be the regulator. So when you go out into the field and walk right of ways, which right of ways are access points for these water lines, about 50 feet around the line that you can walk, even on private property. You're looking for leaks to not only tell them and to say, hey, if this keeps happening, we're going to have to fine you, but also to save them money at the end of the day in both loss of brine water and loss of fresh water that they pull up from our rivers and streams. So it's a mix of both environmental regulation and money saving efforts for that company, like at large. So
That's interesting. So how well does that tie into what you're going to school for? I know you're getting close to finishing up. If you want to even touch base on that a little bit.
oh yeah, two more classes at Slippery Rock for my master's, environmental education. Um, I, like Aaron, kind of wanted to do something going into my, later 20s in terms of either teaching or just educating the public about species that are being lost here in Pennsylvania. So I'm currently working on my environmental education master's, and it ties more so into my geography undergrad, my GIS background, which is kind of directly what you're doing out in the field because you're dropping both pins, points, and creating map systems through KMZ files, which are what are commonly used in what people know as Google Earth. So it's a bit more of map building and then data uploading than it is teaching. But it's a great way to learn something about how the industry is interacting with our environment so that when I get older, I'll kind of know more what I'm talking about when I'm, speaking of these fracking companies. Whether it's to tell the public or whether it's to talk to them directly as a client. So,
Well, I think that it can go hand in hand with a lot of the work that you do, but also we talk about education and teaching, and we talk about fisheries, how that is working with and against the fisheries, with the water quality and with what they both bring into the state in terms of revenue, and then as an educator, how you could tie that into presentations or even taking people on guided hikes. I mean, there's probably so much, or even, thinking about future students, how you'll be able to have those conversations, not even necessarily years from now, but just as you settle into all these different roles, how that could potentially impact your perspective on all of this stuff.
yeah, and regardless of what rules and regulations come from, which politician or which state or the federal government in itself, um, that's always going to be changing. So it's more so just coming to terms with the fact that these companies have certain ways that they play the game, so to say, and that you need to both keep an eye out on them as private citizens and as someone working in the industry. I mean, herpetofauna wise and frog wise, there are so many ways that frogs, salamanders, etc., can absorb pollutants through their skin. And you kind of have to watch out for that because, this industry is not something where the environment is going to go unscathed. So I tell myself that in the back of my head while enforcing these actions, but you still have to show uh, lesser bias when you're actually doing the job. You know what I mean? So it's kind of hard. With trout, especially, they're very sensitive, both temperature and pollutants. So we want to avoid that in the Laurel Highlands, at least, where Powder Mill's situated. So.
Now, is that hard for you when you're evaluating some property if you find stuff that, like wildlife wise, that could be severely impacted, like having to possibly tell them it's safe even though, let's say an animal doesn't have a conservation status where it's deemed important, but
Mhm.
I think you know where I'm headed with that.
No, that's a great question. Right, and the answer is it depends geographically on what state you're in. I think when you get to West Virginia, I work in Moundsville a lot, south of Wheeling. The majority of the work I do is actually in West Virginia, and the enforcement policies that the WVDEP has versus our DCNR in Pennsylvania, as Pennsylvania residents, it's a lot less. So even though you know, hey, this American toad population here is being impacted directly from the drainage of a pad, 5 miles south of Moundsville, um, there are things put into place through the state that allows for them to continue to do so. And you have to look at how the state works from a level of both the Senate and the House there. So in Charleston, South Carolina, they're not really thinking about what's happening up in the Panhandle. And that's a shame because that disconnect leads to further habitat loss. So
I
now
think that. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say now in Waynesburg, the DCNR is keeping an eye on it more so. I was just going to say, but yeah, Waynesburg, PA is another area I do, and you can see the the difference in the West Virginia versus Pennsylvania response. So
That's surprising. I heard while I was at IUP so much about West Virginia. Everybody either went there or they compared everything to West Virginia. It was always better. So it's interesting to hear it might not actually all be better, at least
yeah,
in terms of this type of work.
they're blue line streams, which are the term blue line describes what traditionally holds the native brook trout, which is the state fish of almost half a dozen states here in the United States. They protect those quite well. They do not publish them online like we do in Pennsylvania using the Fish and Boat Commission website. And they like to protect those kind of hidden gems. But when it comes to like the larger streams or the watersheds, like the Ohio River, one of the largest ones in the United States, um, it is almost kind of retroactive where they're not thinking about who that's going to flow to, you know. They do not govern Cincinnati. So when the Ohio gets to Cincinnati, not their problem anymore after it bends, and that's how they look at it too, partially. Which again is a shame because West Virginia is such a beautiful state and they do so many things well at their state park level. It's truly a very great state for the outdoors. So
That's what I mean. So that's why it was kind of a shock when you said about how, there's just some stuff that's not quite as up to par with like what we're doing in terms of just thinking about the habitat.
yeah, yeah, I think it comes down to more so what level you're looking at, whether it's that macro versus micro, that idea of, oh, okay, this pollutant or this watershed that's getting washed out, for example, Fish Creek, which is a bass stream about south of Moundsville, about 3 miles, that flows into a national preserve. Um, they aren't thinking about the creek as much as they're thinking about that national preserve, which shares a border with Ohio. And again, that gap right there and lack of funding for their general DEP um, is causing issues at the grander scale. So
I think that it makes it very compelling with what you're saying with how people need to be informed and they need to understand business and government regardless on if they don't want to really involve it in their lives or if they're like, wearing it on their sleeves like how some people do, where we're in such a heavily criticized and overly fickle political climate right now. But having to also navigate what we care about with the environment, understanding the legislation and how all of these laws are enforced. And, I guess one question I have is, can you potentially be in the business, but also like a lobbyist or like a protester towards what's happening? Like, is that a conflict in like a contract, or is that like, you're allowed to actually do that if you disagree with them, but still like go to work?
Yeah, I'm still allowed to I guess take some type of political stance on that. So, as an educator, I try to just come with an unbiased view of like what you were saying. Educate yourself, inform yourself, know what's going on around you, regardless of what outcome you desire. Because at least at that point, you know what's going on in both the community, state, and then grander level too. So it's more about keeping yourself informed. But yeah, there isn't a conflict of interest. It's interesting. Um, we're a third party contractor and inspector service. So in terms of what these companies, you have the very traditional range resources, EQT, uh, what you see every day on trucks and shipments around the country. These larger companies don't necessarily care as much because they're going to continue business as always, regardless of what happens. So there's um, there's always natural gas underneath those hills, and it's always going to be there. It's just a matter of who can access it first and who can drill it and successfully fracture the ground beneath and suck it all up. So to them, it's more so of a land grab situation. Um, Now, EQT and some of these other companies, they've worked really well with the community in building infrastructure, but there is just a line that needs to be balanced between the communities and their drinking water and their access to a clean environment, especially in Pennsylvania, where that's written in our state constitution. We're one of very few states that has that written in the constitution. So,
That's important, and that's crazy to think about now. Yeah,
yeah.
it really is a big. It should be a bigger talking point than it is.
hmm And it's what it leads to legal cases in Pennsylvania that aren't applicable in other states. Um, the Delaware watershed, which is near Philadelphia, it shares a line with New Jersey. The Delaware Water Gap is up for national park status. They were able to hold off on a lot of fracking line infrastructure because remember, that's not where the Appalachian Plateau is. They are not fracking there, but they are transporting those goods and materials through that central corridor of the United States. And so they ended up blocking a lot of action that was going to happen because of that watershed, because of our state constitution, which gave them legal claim to pursue that action. So, yeah, something to think about at that state level. So,